Let's take a journey in a time machine for a minute. The year is 1900, and you are at the doctor and you have been experiencing chronic pain. Your doctor prescribes you a well-known medicine at the time, and it works really well for you. What if I told you that medicine your doctor prescribed was cannabis? Now, maybe some of you are like Shaggy and Scooby-Doo when it comes to cannabis, or maybe some of you are more in tune with the reefer madness era. Either way, it's important to know the true origins of cannabis and the legal history that have been plagued by racism. First, let's discuss the early origins of cannabis. Cannabis actually has been around for a long time. Hemp was commonly used in ancient China for clothing and rope, and in 2737 BCE, there was the first documented use of cannabis as medicine by Emperor Shen Nang, who used cannabis to treat things like gout, malaria, and poor memory, which is pretty ironic. For the next 30 years, the medical use of cannabis spread throughout the globe. In the 1800s, cannabis plantations were scattered around the United States, and doctors regularly prescribed it. Cannabis could even be found in general stores. But all good things come to an end. In this case, an end caused by racism. By the end of the 1800s, attitudes towards cannabis started to change as many people began freaking out about drugs in general, as alcoholism and opium addiction became issues. In 1906, the United States government passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which said cannabis was dangerous and required to be labeled before being sold. By 1910, the Mexican Revolution had begun, which caused many immigrants to flood into the United States. Mexican people were known at the time to smoke cannabis, or marijuana, as they called it. This led to the 1914 Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, making drug use a crime for the first time. By 1925, the world got together and decided cannabis was horrible and needed to be illegal. Mexican immigrants were once again targeted by the early 1930s as the world was going through the Great Depression and was looking for someone to blame or a scapegoat, which is another example of why the history of cannabis is racist. Now, if you are still on the fence with the history of cannabis being racist, let me introduce you to Harry Anslinger. Harry Anslinger was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and it was he who launched a relentless campaign against cannabis and spoke before Congress to get them to make the plant illegal. A particular quote that really illustrates the racism that was accepted by Congress came out of Anslinger's mouth and was that reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. The sentiments expressed by Harry Anslinger were met with agreement in Congress and led to the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which added cannabis to the narcotic drugs regulated by the federal government through taxation, which effectively outlawed cannabis sale and possession. By 1970, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, which was an act against counterculture movements at the time and placed cannabis as a Schedule I drug, which has the heaviest restrictions and penalties. In the 1980s and 90s, law enforcement cracked down on marijuana use, and minorities were disproportionately targeted, and this continues to happen today. And this is why the history behind cannabis is racist and continues to be. To illustrate how the laws surrounding cannabis continue to destroy the lives of minorities, I want to tell the story of Fate Winslow. Fate Winslow is a black man who received a life sentence in 2008 for just $20 worth of cannabis. Thankfully, Winslow was resentenced to time served, but he still had served a full 12 years. Winslow's daughter stated how, "I cannot wait to have my dad fully back in my life. He deserves a second chance, and I'm so glad he is getting one." But many people still remain sitting in jail for inhumane amount of time for non-violent cannabis charges, and the majority of these people are minorities. Imagine if this was your friend or relative being locked away over a plant that has little research indicating its harm. Despite roughly equal usage rates, Black people are 3.73 times more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana. Our generation can take a stand against this racist history. Cannabis is still listed as a Schedule I drug, and Schedule I drugs are said to not have any medical use, although the evidence points clearly to its possibility for medical use. I personally know several people in my life who have medical cards for the chronic pain they endure, and cannabis keeps them from turning to opioids, which are highly addictive. Now that you know the racist history behind cannabis, whether you have been on board with cannabis all along or you have been skeptical, it's important to push for cannabis being removed off of the Schedule I drug list. Let us work together to educate others on the origin of cannabis. Let us fight for what is right. Let us band together to stop life sentence convictions that tear families apart over a plant that also helps thousands and more cope with various medical issues. Let us work to stop the conditions that the system continues to perpetuate. Let us join together to finally put an end to this racist history. And that is how cannabis's history was built on racism but will no longer continue to be. Thank you.